This is lecture number 2 for this week. And in lecture 2, we're talking about urbanization. And this is the main topic of the article that we had for this week by Kingsley Davis. And this one here, it's available on, you can see that, it's available on Canvas. And please try to read it. There will be some questions on the quiz on that reading. It's a very good one, very insightful. It was written a while ago, but it's still one of the more popular essays about population growth, and this guy was a real famous guy. And so here we are. The majority of population growth in the last 200 years has taken place in cities. And so for all the, whatever, 200,000 years that human beings roamed Earth's surface, there was nothing like this. Well, nothing like this, cities of this size, until the last 50 years or so. And no cities to really speak of in terms of real size, starting around 200 years ago. So we are really living in a unique moment in the history of the world. This is a great quote from Kingsley Davis. In fact, I think it's the very first paragraph, where he says that urbanization represents a new and fundamental step in man's, and he should have said woman's, social evolution. So urbanization represents a new and fundamental step in man's and woman's social evolution. And hence, again, we're living in a new time in world history. So this really does mark a real epic change in the world. And one more look here again at this chart, just again to underscore the rapidity of population growth and urbanization. Another nice quote from Kingsley Davis is, urbanization involves a degree of human contact and social complexity never before known. So up until just a few hundred years ago, societies for the most part were pretty simple, pretty small, were very spread out. People knew one another. Technology wasn't very developed. Things were simple. People believed in the same ideas, the same religion. They spoke the same language. They looked the same. And today, people are close together. Societies are very complex. I'll go back to this picture here. We can see how crowded cities can be. And people literally, living on top of each other, working on top of each other, very close together. A lot of different kinds of people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, people speaking different languages and worshiping different religions and so on. So, and of course, the technology that we have today. And when I say technology, we'll come back to this idea of technology a number of times in the class. We're not necessarily talking about the most recent iPhone, although that is a good example of a technology, but in general, a way of doing things. Our understanding of how we do things is just much more sophisticated now. Our knowledge of how the world works is more sophisticated. We can manipulate the world in amazing ways. I have another picture that I put up here. Okay, we'll go back. I'll come back to this word density in a second. I put this picture into my PowerPoint slide. I just went to Google and typed in, I think I typed in busy street in New York. But just to kind of help us underscore the fact of people being crowded together, living densely in dense communities. And this is just a picture of people walking down the street, but look how packed it is. Something unheard of a couple hundred years ago. And I have this word density highlighted in red here. And it's a concept that it's a very interesting concept and very important one. And it's pretty straightforward. Density refers to the proportion of people that are living close together. If you go to the census, you can actually get data on this. And I think a typical way that the census measures density in the United States is the number of people that live per square mile. Now let's see. Some cities in the United States are more dense than others. This is another way that we can think about this. If we think of Bakersfield, it's not a very dense city. It's a pretty small city. People are kind of spread out. We think of New York City, where people are really packed in together. It's a very highly dense city. So this idea of density, again, it will come up in a number of different contexts in this course. Maybe I'll just make one point here. The question has emerged for the last 100 years or more. How dense can cities become? And is density a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a healthy thing or an unhealthy thing? Now, I think if you ask students, if we were sitting in a classroom, I would ask you this, and usually students will say, would prefer a less dense city. If we become too dense, then somehow we're going to lose our quality of life, and it becomes potentially unhealthy and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, I think many students, without really kind of realizing it, prefer to live in a big city. Cities are kind of where it's happening. Cities are vibrant, active, fun places. So it's a very interesting idea. Let's see. The question, another important, I'll make one more point with respect to density that I think we can all relate to. There's a lot of debate today concerning how Los Angeles should continue to grow in terms of, with respect to its population growth. Los Angeles is projected to continue to grow population-wise. And if more people are going to be moving in, where are people going to live? So the idea is that we're going to have to somehow grow up rather than out, because Los Angeles has been growing outwards for several decades, just building communities and housing and so on further and further out. But when you do that, you create a real ecological disaster. For example, look at our transportation system. People live so far from where they work that the freeways are just a disaster. So a lot of people feel like we need to grow upwards, or that Los Angeles and neighborhoods around Los Angeles will becoming more dense. We'll see more high rises. We'll see more and more people living in downtown Los Angeles, for example. So this is a very important debate in urban studies and planning. How for those cities that will continue to grow, how do you accommodate population growth? especially with respect to housing and work. Okay, so let me move on then from that here. One more quote from the Kingsley Davis article here, and I think this is an important one. From his perspective, he says that, quote, urbanization is a finite process, a cycle through which nations go in their transition from agrarian to an industrial society. So he's kind of arguing that there is, some end to the urbanization process. It's not going to continue forever. It is some kind of natural cycle that countries go through as we transition from old farming, agricultural communities to an industrial society. And this transition is part of the Industrial Revolution that most countries, many countries have gone through. We'll come back to the Industrial Revolution a little bit later in the class. Now here's an interesting curve. I found this in a textbook, and I think this is an illustration of Kingsley Davis's S-curve. He has some S-curves in his paper that you can take a look at. I think this one gives a better visualization of this idea of an S-curve. Grab my pen here. So in this graph, we go back to 1850, and some countries in the world started their industrial revolution around this time, roughly. The United States did. Some countries in Europe were a little bit earlier. But regardless here, the percent of the population living in urban areas is this green portion here. Now, how you define that is, I'll come back to that in a minute, and I'm not too worried, and I'm not going to require you to be able to answer that question. How do we define what is urban and what's not? I'll come back to that in a second. I think we kind of just have a basic understanding of people living in cities, in these dense places with a lot of cement. That's what we're talking about when we talk about urbanization. And so the percent of the people living in these places with a lot of cement and so on increased right here. So it really starts to increase here. The pace of the increase is pretty rapid. And then at some point, it will start to level off. Kingsley Davis says it will vary between countries. The S-curve will look a little bit different, but we'll have this basic shape. And it will start to level off. Population growth will start to, population growth will start to decline, and so will urbanization, the rate of urbanization. And so this is the year 2000 from his chart here. Now there's some debate about this. Will urbanization really slow down? Will population growth really slow down? Okay, so this is the S-curve. I think the concept of an S-curve is an important one, and I do want you to remember that. I think I'll ask you a question on the quiz about, making reference to an S-curve. Okay. Now, what happened here? Okay. Excuse me for Okay, now what happened? Okay. Okay. Okay, sorry about this little glitch. Not really sure what happened there. Let's see. Okay. Uh, let me pause this for just a second. Okay, I'll just continue here. There's a little tiny box on the top. I don't know. I'll get rid of that later. A couple of kind of miscellaneous PowerPoints here. This shows the 50 largest cities in the United States as of 2014. And so one way to illustrate the process of urbanization in the United States. And the largest city is New York, 8.4 million. That's there at the top there on your top right. Shows the size of the city. And behind that is Los Angeles. That's up here on the right. So the top one is New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Philadelphia, Phoenix, San Antonio, San Diego, Dallas, San Jose, Austin, Jacksonville, San Francisco. So a lot of those bigger cities now are on the kind of the West Coast and in the South. Here is a here is an important graph that I threw in here. Let's see, the order of this didn't come off very well. One of the points that Kingsley Davis makes, and this is a very important point, is he raises the question, where does the population come from for these cities that are growing? So yes, we've talked about world population growth. But that population growth theoretically could be taking place in a very spread out way. I mean, there's a lot of room on the world's surface. There's a lot of unused land. People could just be spread out and everybody would be farmers. 7 billion people would be farmers. So urbanization kind of refers to the fact that people are not living spread out, are not living in spread out, what we might call rural places. Instead, they are they're concentrated. Now, an interesting thing here is that, at least early on, this is not true today, but if we go back 200 years to the year 1800, we go back 100 years to the year 1900, the cities had high death rates. People didn't live very long in cities. They were very kind of dirty, unhygienic places. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, and so on would spread rapidly, especially among working class populations. So the population growth of cities came from rural areas. People moved away from the farm, they moved out of agriculture, and they moved to cities. So go back here to if we go back to this PowerPoint here, and we can just imagine, say in 1900, people were moving from the farmlands, from farms, into cities. And that accounted for how cities were growing and becoming more dense. Coming back to this chart here, we can see that in 1830, 70% of the US population lived on farms in 1830. And that just declined significantly ever since then. It declined at the same time that cities were growing, it declined at the same time that the Industrial Revolution took place. And today, less than 5% of the population live on farms. So that's a very important point. I'll try and come back to that again. I kind of threw this point in. It's a very important one. Clear this first, I guess. That. Okay, here's another graph that is an illustration of how rapidly population growth is taking place. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I had to refresh myself here. The top line, the red line, represents world population growth. So that's something we've been talking about quite a bit. Starting around 1950, there's about 2.5 billion people in the world, and it goes up. This is that red line. And so today we're somewhere around 7.6 billion, and it's going to continue to increase here. Now, these lines over here represent the proportion urban versus rural. So this green line here, this is the proportion of the world that lives in cities, that is urban. And this is the proportion of the world that is, oops, I have that wrong, I'm sorry. The green line is rural. This gray line is urban. So if we follow the gray line here, we see that more and more of the world is living in urban areas. And if we follow the green line, more and more of the world is in rural areas. Now this is the world. The previous graph referred to people living on the farm in the United States. So if we look at from a world perspective, a lot of the world is still very rural. Okay. Okay, here's some more interesting data. This is from the United Nations, and it shows the number of different sizes of cities in 1990, 2014, and 2030. First, we talked about megacities. We'll come back to megacities in a minute. Megacities are those huge cities today where there are at least 10 million people. In 1990, there was 10, and today it's closer to 28, 2014, and it will increase to 41 by the year 2030. come back to these in a minute. Large cities, those with 5 to 10 million people, increased from 21 in 1990 to 43 in 2014, projected to be 63 by 2030. Medium-sized cities will also grow significantly. Cities with 1 to 5 million people, there were 239 in 1990, 214, 417 in 2014, and projected to be 558 by the year 2030. And then smaller cities, these are still pretty big actually, 500,000 to 1 million people. There were 294 in 1990, 525 in 2014, and 731 in 2030. That's the projection. So as I mentioned a second ago, megacities are those large, we can call them metropolitan areas, huge urban areas where there's 10 million or more people. So these are the huge cities. By 2050, 7 out of 10 people will live in megacities. Let's take a look at where those megacities are. So the red dots refer to the megacities. Los Angeles. Now, just as a side note, if you're going to call Los Angeles a megacity, well, you're really looking at not just the city proper, in other words, the official definition of the city of Los Angeles, but you're including surrounding cities and urban areas. As I mentioned before, I don't want to get into these kind of definitions because it starts to get a little tedious, and I don't think we really serves much of a purpose for us as of right now. So Mexico City, New York, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Mumbai, Calcutta, Tokyo. So these are some of the major megacities in the world today. The circles here that are orange are cities that are soon to become megacities. These are cities which have between 8 and 10 million people. Lagos, Cairo, and so on, Paris. And then the yellow circles will probably be megacities in the next couple of decades. And these are cities with between 5 and 8 million people. Bogota, Lima, Chicago, and so on. Here's a picture of Mumbai, a classic megacity in the less developed world, a world where in some places is making a transition to a more developed society, but is still, in the case of Mumbai, very poor. Tokyo, which is the largest megacity in the world, and this is an example of a megacity in the advanced world. And there will be more cities like this in the next few decades. Okay, I have one more PowerPoint slide. Sorry to disappoint you. I want to make some final comments about the Kingsley Davis reading that, again, I hope you will do and take seriously because it's a very informative and important reading. I made this point earlier and just want to reinforce it one more time. The urban population has historically come from rural areas. So when we think about the United States, as Chicago grew over the course of the 20th century, as Los Angeles grew over the course of the 20th century, the majority of those people came from farming communities, from rural areas, and they're coming to the cities in search of work, in search of more opportunity, and in search of a better quality of life and a higher standard of living in most instances. The Industrial Revolution was a major cause of urbanization and, importantly, made urbanization possible. When we think about the Industrial Revolution, we think of advances in technology. During the Industrial Revolution, for example, we invented and discovered steel. Without steel, cities would not be possible today. During the Industrial Revolution, we discovered oil, at least how to harness oil into energy. And so cities would not have been possible without sources of power, without we call it inanimate sources of power to generate power and energy. To reiterate this point again, urbanization is taking place most rapidly today in the underdeveloped world, in underdeveloped countries. And we really need to emphasize that. We're seeing the rise of these mega cities more in the less developed world, and they emerged much more rapidly than it took cities in the developed world. So just in the short span of a few decades, these cities have just grown tremendously, outpaced cities in places like the United States. And then finally, this is an important point, and I think I will probably ask you a question about this on the quiz this week, is unlike earlier periods of urbanization, urban population in underdeveloped countries is not coming from rural areas. Instead, it is due to population growth everywhere. So an important point here, this is a point emphasized by Kingsley Davis, is that cities have become much more hygienic, have become much healthier. Quality, health standards are much higher today. People don't, the death rate isn't as high in cities anymore. Again, go back 100 years, the death rate was much higher in cities than it was in rural areas, and that is no longer the case. So I think this is an interesting point, and I think for people concerned with population growth and so on, this is a concern they have, that you're not seeing a transition in the less developed countries where people are moving from rural areas into the cities that we once saw in places like the United States. Instead, population growth is taking place so rapidly everywhere that it's becoming more densely packed, more densely populated, and so this is an area of concern for a number of reasons. Okay, so I think I covered all I wanted to cover, and these are the 2 lectures for this week. Again, give me an email if you have any questions at all, and good luck with the quiz.